Mind Matter Media presents Designing Nature's Half, the Landscape Conservation Podcast, where discussions center around the most current and innovative approaches to landscape conservation and design. This is the show for stakeholders who want to adapt to the climate crisis, halt biodiversity loss, and change the world by designing sustainable and resilient landscapes through collaborative conservation action.
Hey everyone, welcome to Designing Nature's Half, the Landscape Conservation Podcast. I'm your co-host, Rob Campoloni.
And I'm your other co-host, Tom Ewald. So Rob, I'm really excited about this week's guest, Willem Verweerde. He's the founder of an international NGO focused on landscape restoration and management called Commonland. I've been long interested in landscape approaches outside of the United States. There's different approaches and methods and frameworks that are out there outside of the U.S. So I just found it really interesting what Commonland produced. They really impressed me with when I heard about them 2 or 3 years ago. What really impressed me was their framework called 4 Returns, which provides a nice synthesis of the solution space of landscape management. I want to note something important here too, Rob, that we talk a lot about landscape conservation, but as we talk with Commonland and 1000 Landscapes, it's more about landscape management or restoration that is kind of the focus. And so conservation being one component again, that would be a good topic to explore, kind of the difference of those different terms.
Yeah, let me quickly provide my perspective on that, if I can, Tom, since you opened that door. What I hear you saying is that the broad term of landscape management incorporates a broader suite of activities, one of which is conservation. But it may also include restoration and resource extraction, and potentially even include a larger suite of activities on the landscape like development. If that's the case, I don't actually think there's much of a difference between landscape management and landscape conservation, except for the perceived notion that by using the term management, we're saying we know what we're doing in terms of sustainably managing the landscape. And I'm not convinced we actually do, at least in this age of the Anthropocene. And I say that as someone who has 2 degrees and a 30-year career in natural resources planning and management. There's a body of literature out there that suggests that that may have been the case during the relatively stable Holocene epoch, but that the assumptions that we used during the Holocene won't necessarily hold up in the age of the Anthropocene. And as such, an entirely new model must be developed. I think the idea of landscape conservation, and for me, that means conserving sustainable landscapes for people, planet, and prosperity, opens the door to a new transformational approach to how we perceive and live on the land. To this day, that transformational approach isn't fully realized, but we're getting there. And organizations like Commonland are proof that we're moving in the right direction. I'd love to hear Willem's perspective on that during our round of questions. Maybe that'll be my first question to Willem when the time comes.
So let's go ahead and introduce our guest, Willem Verweerde. Willem is the founder of Commonland, a nonprofit foundation that supports local actors to develop long-term solutions at a landscape scale for biodiversity, carbon, regenerative agriculture, businesses, and communities. He lived and worked with poor farmers on the impact of agriculture and the recovery of natural vegetation. After finalizing his studies, he organized expeditions to remote nature areas in Latin America and Europe. In 1995, Verweerde set up the Dutch-funded Rainforest Grants Program at IUCN Netherlands. From 2000 to 2012, he led IUCN Netherlands as executive director, set up ecosystem grants programs working on wetlands, rainforests, and grasslands in more than 40 countries and 1,500 projects. In 2005, he founded, together with Eric Egon Zender and McKinsey, a business network to enable a dialogue between business CEOs and conservation leaders in 4 countries. In the Netherlands, this resulted in an agreement on biodiversity between VNO-NCW, or the Confederation of Netherlands Industry and Employers, and 35 nature organizations in 2010. In 2012, he developed a practical way to restore large landscapes, the 4 Returns framework. That was inspired by the ecosystem approach of the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. It was published by IUCN. In 2013, he founded Commonland to build proof of that concept of on the ground work by using that framework. Verweerde is executive fellow at the Rotterdam School of Management, Erasmus University, a theme lead at the IUCN Commission on Ecosystem Management in Switzerland, an advisor and or board member on several organizations such as the Charles Darwin Foundation, the Princess Irene van Lip-Bijsterveld Nature College Foundation, and the 1,000 Landscapes for a Billion People Initiative, and Regen 10. So, Willem, did I miss anything from your bio that you'd like to add?
Yeah, thank you very much, gentlemen. Lovely to be here, and thanks for the invitation. Yeah, I'm just a normal human being, and I love nature. I'm very much inspired by nature, and especially have been working with indigenous people in Latin America. A bio is something, but yeah, I'm trying to be humbled, trying to spread the word what I'm doing as an ecologist, as a normal human being. That's basically what you sometimes miss when you read out a bio. That's me. Yeah. I'm raised in Amsterdam, but I actually realized after a few years, in my 30s, 40s, that the cities weren't the place for me to live. So I don't live in the city anymore, but outside.
Hey, Willem, welcome to the podcast. I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to my perspective on Tom's comment about landscape management versus landscape conservation, which was that in both cases, I think we're trying to achieve landscape sustainability. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, here again, wording and the narrative is very important. I'm trained and have been working in the conservation world for many, many years in Latin America and Europe, and also doing projects in Africa and Asia. Conserving the soil and, let's say, take good care of the ecosystems that surrounds us should be a logical thing to do. And I'm with you that it's very difficult. If you talk about management, you increasingly also talk about having control, but we don't have a lot of control. What we can do is try to understand nature and work with nature as much as possible and restore and conserve the ecological functionality of landscapes. And that means, yes, you need to have protected areas. You need to have ecological corridors between protected areas. Agriculture or other forms of land use should be as much as possible sustainable. Those logical things should be in the forefront of our, what I call restoration industry that some way one day will come. So maybe the three words regenerative, restoration, and conservation are part of a setting in a landscape. And I can talk a little bit more about it later if that's okay.
Yeah, no, that we'd love to hear more about that. I think you're right that one of the things that's important is kind of a shared sense of language and narrative when communicating about something as complex and long-term as landscape management, landscape conservation, landscape restoration, whatever you want to call it. So what lessons have you learned over the years in terms of the use of language in your experience? For example, maybe you learned at some point that, this word doesn't work here, but maybe it works there, or it resonates with a different audience. So what kind of work has Commonland done to synthesize or make the language more universal?
Yeah. Now, when I was working at IUCN with philanthropists and public funders, I realized that time was a critical element. Most of those funders had their ideas and they were forced to fund activities within a time frame of less than 5 years. And of course, when you live and have living on the ground and working with farmers and protected area managers, 5 years is nothing. You cannot do a lot within 5 years. You can do something, but not a lot. So this time frame was a real issue. Another thing was that you can protect or restore a small area, with some millions. But if the wider area is destroyed because of, change of land use methodologies, you may argue that the project you're doing will at the end will fail because within that wider ecosystem, it will not survive. So that's why scale is important. The most important issue is of course that within the economic system that we are part of now, biodiversity is not valued and ecosystem services are very limited until now. maybe with the exception of carbon that is coming up. So my whole career at IUCN was trying to find the right wording and words to bring in other actors in the field of conservation and restoration, or in the field of ecosystem management, as some people might call it. But here, of course, we have to deal with the word management, as I mentioned before, management and control and so on. So when I left IUCN in 2012, I decided to dedicate my time for a year in a kind of a sabbatical in between phase to look for what are the words that resonate to as many as possible stakeholders, the finance industry, business people, public funders, and the politicians, as well as people on the ground like farmers, protected area managers, indigenous people, and so on. And I realized that search for wording was beyond the jargon where I came from, the jargon of ecosystem, biodiversity, ecosystem services, etc. Payment, PES, RED, all these words. And I realized that at the end, there were a few words that resonated with everybody. And those were 3 words, actually: losses, risks, and returns. And of course, that these words vary in the different languages, whether you talk in Spanish or in Dutch or in English or in French or in German or whatever. But still, these 3 words were resonating everywhere. And that's when I started to think, how can I translate the principles of the ecosystem approach, which you mentioned, Tom, was endorsed by the Convention on Biological Diversity already 24 years ago. Very good principles, but theoretical principles, very difficult to use. How to translate those principles about sustainable landscape management into an approach that could be attractive to create a vision, as well as be attractive to do the right things in the future and to create a kind of a plan how to restore a large landscape and what kind of steps are needed. And if you really look at degraded large landscape, a deforested or over-harvested or monocultural area where you have a lot of erosion, you know those landscapes. It could be a wetland system that has been drained, or a rainforest that has been depleted, or a grassland system that has been overgrazed. All those things. If you look at a landscape and you translate that into terms of loss, normally we would say there will be a lot of biodiversity loss in that landscape, but there are more losses. There are social losses, because quite often communities are depleted and people are leaving those places. There are financial losses, not maybe from the big corps that are acting in those landscapes, but definitely smallholders will have financial losses, and local communities. You have the biodiversity loss, but I also realized when talking to many people in those landscapes that there was something else that was missing, and that was another loss, and that was the loss of hope and purpose and pride. And that loss actually became one of the central pillars of my thinking when I realized that if you want to bring stakeholders together with a new landscape vision to bring hope back, you need to identify and talk about the loss of hope and the loss of purpose and the loss of pride and so on. So those 4 losses actually helped me to frame a new narrative that was more attractive for people to buy into what is landscape restoration and conservation by talking about returns. And the first return then was the return of hope, or the return of inspiration. I deliberately called it the ROI, the return of inspiration, because you can use the ROI in different ways, of course. Normally, people will tell you that ROI is return on investment. But if you talk to people from businesses, successful businesses, they understand that ROI is not only about return on investment. It starts actually with the return of inspiration, because you create a product or something that is inspiring, or that gives people, a kind of sense of pride or whatever. So the return of inspiration is number 1. You need to return inspiration and hope if you want to restore a landscape. And the second thing is, of course, to complement the social losses by return of the social returns, communities that you want to have back in those landscapes, and the sense of purpose with a sense of good, new kind of jobs in those landscapes, which is all about return of income financial returns in a sustainable way. And the most normal, the most logical one that we know in this podcast as well is of course the return of biodiversity and the return of healthy soils, the return of a well-functioning aquifer, these kind of things. So we call that the natural returns. So a restored landscape is characterized by 4 returns or 4 values or 4 benefits, whatever you call it. I prefer to use the word return because you can explain it easier when you talk about losses and returns. And a restored landscape will also, over time, will be more resilient and thus will have less risks for people, governments, and businesses who are dealing with such restored landscape. So here the word risk is coming in. And that's how I built that storyline in 2012 and wrote it down and published it under IUCN at that time when I, during my sabbatical. And yeah, that was the starting point of Commonland, basically.
I agree completely with your return on inspiration and this feeling of a loss of hope that people are feeling, their disconnection with the land, if you will,
Yeah.
which leads to, I think, that feeling of loss, that lack of hope for a future, a better future for all. And I really like how you've kind of thought about building a response to that concern into your framework. I guess I'd like to hear your perspective or hear you speak a little bit more about what the natural return kind of looks like on the ground. I tend to think that you're probably speaking to the idea of restoring biodiversity, building resilient landscapes, if you will, but just want to give you an opportunity to kind of expand on that.
The 4 returns was a starting point. And what I did, I also put it as a generic starting point, and you can put generic key performance indicators under each return. So you can, in fact, measure progress. But of course, what is happening on the ground is a different thing. And that means you need to think, do those people living in those areas, do they have a profound understanding of what a landscape is? And some of them, yes, they do. But others, they don't. Even farmers, quite often, they don't. So I thought, how can we help people within such massive area of 100,000 hectares or even more understand what the landscape is and what are the components of such a landscape? And what I did is I brought down again in a language the issue of zoning. For ecologists, it is quite easy. People, scientists or ecologists, they look at a landscape and they see different ecosystems within that landscape. A wetland here, a montane forest over there. You might have a savanna system there. So there are different zones in such a landscape. But for many people, this is not understandable. They cannot read landscapes. So what I did is I brought in the idea of zoning, but in a very different way. I actually said, each landscape is composed of 3 zones. And with each sustainable, each resilient landscape or restored landscape is composed of 3 zones. You have a natural zone, which are the places where nature thrives, where if you're lucky, those areas are protected, protected areas, where those protected areas are quite often connected through ecological corridors. That is what you could call the natural zone. And also the places where you still have nature, but those are not yet protected or, are hill slopes where you still have a remnant forest and so on. So that is a natural zone. And you want to have a very large amount or a substantial amount of natural or protected areas or zones in your landscape. The second zone is the place where you have land use, mostly agriculture. And quite often, those forms of agriculture are intensive, industrial, or consist of monocultures with a lot of chemical input. And what you prefer is that that zone, that monoculture zone, is being turned into what I called in my language a zone where you combine agriculture, productivity, with biodiversity. So I call that the combined zone, to make sure that people understand that you combine two things, productivity and biodiversity. And if you look into, what that is, then in the current wording, most people will explain it by that is the place where you have regenerative agriculture, or you have agroforestry systems there, or places where you combine things with rotational grazing, the Ellen Savory method and so on. So this is the place where you produce in as far as possible sustainable way. And there are different forms of sustainability. I mean, this is not all organic agriculture or whatever. This is a zone that is in transition, moving away from agriculture or land use that is working against nature towards new forms of agriculture and land use, trying to work with nature. And then you have the third zone, which is, I call it the economic zone, which is the place where people live, where you have hard infrastructure, where you have fabrics, and where you have cities and roads. And so that people recognize that a city is part of a landscape. And that you are not disconnected within a city from a landscape, whether that landscape is just around the corner. And quite often in big cities or places like where I live in the Netherlands, where you have, of course, a huge impact on landscapes on the other side of the planet because of import of goods and services. But in general, each landscape should deliver well-balanced 3-zone. And in those 3 zones, you have a lot of activities and projects, whether those are commercial or not commercial, protected area management. It helps to understand that you need to strive for a well-balanced 3 zones approach to achieve those 4 returns. And that brings you to the next thing, and that is you need time to make that happen. And that is maybe the most difficult thing to explain, because we tend to think in years or quarters, especially business people or investors. 15 years is a hell of a lot of time, but we all know that 15 years from an ecological standpoint is nothing. You can build, you can restore something or you can protect something, but planting a tree is easy, but growing a tree is very difficult, and that takes decades or centuries sometimes. So time is a very important component, and that's why we said, okay, 4 returns are delivered by a 3-zone approach in a minimum time frame of 20 years, with the minimum in bold.
What if we could rescue the planet from the ravages of the climate crisis and, in the process, save 1 million species from extinction? Would we do it? Former U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Senior Policy Advisor for the National Wildlife Refuge System, Robert Campoloni, explores the United States' most pressing conservation challenge since Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the triple planetary crisis: pollution, climate boiling, and biodiversity loss. In Designing Nature's Half, a practical guide to conserve 50% by 2050, Campoloni reveals previous nationwide initiatives to design sustainable and resilient landscapes, provides an easy-to-follow how-to guide for taking a collaborative, science-based approach to identify conservation actions across large landscapes, and advocates for taking a third nationwide try to design nature's half. Learn how to take a synergistic approach to mitigating the climate crisis and conserving biodiversity in Designing Nature's Half, a practical guide to conserve 50% by 2050 and be part of the global movement to save the planet. For more information, visit www.designingnatureshalf.com.
As a conservation biologist, I think in terms of protected areas, buffer zones, and corridors, and then the larger matrix.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, your 3-zone approach fits in very nicely with the basic tenets of conservation biology, where protected areas fall within your protection zone.
Yeah.
The combined zone is clearly what conservation biologists think of as buffer zones.
Correct.
Your economic zone is the larger matrix. You don't speak specifically to corridors, but they're probably folded into the combined zones, because even in corridors, we could manage those for diversity of uses. So I think your three zone approach is a sound one, and I like how you've kind of thought through the framework within each of those three zones, Willem. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, most welcome. And you are so right. I mean, when I was working at IUCN, I was funding a lot of projects in the tropics, rainforest conservation, and many of those projects had a buffer zone. So, money was needed to pay park guards, protected area managers, but on the other hand, you wanted to develop a kind of alternative industry or tourism industry around a protected area or national park in the buffer zone. But there was also a problem with the buffer zones, and you might know that if a national park became very successful, buffer zones tended to be crowded, and that means they were kind of attracting people as a magnet to that protected area, with the result at a certain stage that because there were not enough jobs in those buffer zones, they were entering the park during the night or started poaching or work illegal deforestation. I like the concept of buffer zone a lot, but I realize that within a landscape approach, you can make conservation only successful if you start to work on new regenerative businesses within that combined zone. And quite often the combined zone or the buffer zone is much bigger than a protected area as we talk about large landscapes. So what I'm proposing actually is that many of the very intensive agricultural lands is starting to think about, how to move away from very intensive practices towards, regenerative ag practices that are still very attractive from a commercial point of view, because you will work with risk in a situation where climate change is increasingly influencing production. So you need to build resilience into those agricultural landscapes. And that's why indeed, the ecological corridors, while they are part of the natural zone, they are laying physically, of course, in the combined zone because they're connecting areas.
As you talk about this framework, this podcast is very focused on landscape design and planning. I think these elements that you bring up are very relevant to how Rob and I have thought about landscape design and planning. So I'm curious how this looks like on the ground. So is there a mapping process? I see that in your five elements, there's this collaborative vision and planning step. So in that step, is that where you would kind of assess the zones within the landscape and where they are, and then do you think about what a future scenario for those zones might look like? I'm just kind of curious, like how does that, it's not maybe particularly mapping per se that's happening, or maybe it is.
Yeah.
How does that kind of play out?
Yeah, Tom, that's exactly how it goes. Imagine that in most of those landscapes, there are a lot of actors already working, and local NGOs, protected area managers, local city councils that think about sustainability and so on, farmers that are already working on organic or regenerative ag farming, but most of them are quite isolated, and some of them like to work more together. And so what happens when we started Commonland and is that we were invited to some places to see, can we help with this approach to create a better understanding among all those stakeholders? That was number one. And the second was, can we co-create a landscape vision together? And that's what we did when we started to work with our local colleagues in South Africa and Spain, and later also in Australia and India, and even in our very dense populated country, the Netherlands. We started to co-create a landscape vision. And within that process of co-creation, and we use an approach called the Theory U that was, that was developed by MIT, Otto Scharmer and the Processing Institute, which is a very effective approach to bring stakeholders together and to, with the four terms framework, to help them to understand and give them some guidance, or give them a kind of a landscape lens, how they could see where the three zones were now and how they should evolve, let's say, the coming 20, 30 or 40 years. So from a narrative and a language tool, it really helped. But at the end, you're right. You're just sitting around with a whole group of people around the map, of an area, identify where is the combined zone. And you will probably realize that they will probably realize that the combined zone does not exist, but you have a lot of agriculture. And you want to change those forms of agriculture over time, or transform them into more region ag practicalities. And that takes time. But the fact that that people, farmers, conventional farmers, that they see from a helicopter view what's going on in their landscape through the zoning, and start to get it that they need to change some of the practices, and strengthen the connectivity through corridors, and strengthen protected area management, or park management. And on the other hand, transform the land use system. That zoning way of thinking helps a lot. While it's maybe not scientifically the right wording, it helps to bring people on board on creating a landscape vision around the map at a certain stage. And that process, that is what we help to enable and to guide.
I want to bring you back to the 4 returns framework one more time, because there's one more aspect of it that I find very intriguing, and that's regarding the financial return. You've alluded to it a number of times during our conversation already, how important it is to bring people that are living on the landscape, they're living, working, playing on the landscape, importance of bringing them into the process to ensure their own survival, their own sustainability on the landscape, while at the same time doing so in a sustainable manner as it relates to the critters that we care about. So how do you do that? How do you have that? What does that conversation look like with people who aren't necessarily of a conservation mindset, or maybe they are, but their own survival has to come first before they could begin to care about the landscape and the critters that live on it? How do you have that conversation? What does it look like? And how do you begin to build a sustainable economy, not only for the people that live on the landscape, but for the landscape itself?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Rob. I mean, this is, of course, very, very difficult, because you come from a situation where most of the activities in those landscapes are I tend to say fueled by the degradation economy. Intensive agriculture, clear cutting, deforestation, you name it, pollution, it's all there. So what happens first is that you enable people to look through a lens they haven't looked through before, a landscape lens. And therefore we use the 4 returns and the zoning and the time frame and so on. They very much welcome that, everyone. We haven't been in sessions where they didn't like it. They loved it. And many of them, whether you were in South Africa or in Spain or other places where we started to do this, and we are still active there, we opened up a new way of thinking for them. And that was exactly what we wanted to achieve. That is, that they would have a better understanding of how ecology is enabling many of the processes that they are part of in such huge areas. The next step is, and then again, time comes in, if you want to help farmers to move from A to B, from, let's say, non-sustainable to sustainable practices, there are many strings attached, and there are many barriers that you need to overcome. One of the first barriers is time. You cannot do this overnight. So because people have their income, and their income quite often is because of unsustainable agriculture. So what are the first things you can do then to help them to move from A to B? First of all is step-by-step learning from each other. There are some farmers out there quite often that already made that transition. So we organize cafes or meetings where they exchange and where they can learn from each other. We also have set up in some of those places small regenerative ag companies where we try to bring the right principles of regenerative ag into that country or into the landscape. and with protocols and with guidance, and help them to give them access to markets, which is difficult. We have a regenerative almond company, Almendrejesa, in Spain. We set it up, and olive oil and wine and so on. And that is moving in the good direction. But it really takes time. You need to have the right people on board that drive those processes. You need to work with farmers associations that are out there already, and you need to convince them to change and help them and enable them with funding also to cover the valley of debt that those farmers then might have if they move from A to B. So that really takes time. But you also need to think about the bigger story. And the bigger story is again about risks and returns. What if you don't restore that landscape when climate will change? There will be huge risk from an infrastructure perspective. So we recently came out with published a report on large-scale holistic landscape restoration and the finance of this in Europe. And we used the example of large infrastructural investments. For instance, a high-speed train between two big cities and the cost associated to that, and the stakeholder management processes you need to do to make sure that this high-speed train can run. And why it is easier to find funding for these large infrastructure projects, billions of dollars or euros, and it is almost impossible to do the same thing for a large landscape, while there are many people living in those places. So we are at the beginning, I think, of this process. We tested several companies. We set up several companies in the landscapes where we have been working, and we are looking into the payment for ecosystem services. We are also testing now in Zambia how we can work with carbon finance and carbon farming and cook stoves, and all that comes together in what we call a landscape finance model, or a blended landscape finance model of a landscape. And that is what we see there, is that at least you need to have philanthropy available for a few decades to fund the process of people coming together, designing new ways of companies, working on project activities in those three zones as a local engine. And it is very difficult to find funding for that local people engine at a landscape scale to move forward. But as soon as you have that in place, and there is a situation where you have a landscape partnership evolved and popping up with farmers, conservationists, and local city councils working together to make this happen, and entrepreneurs, you create a new dynamic. And within that new dynamic, first impact investors started to become interested, and later also late public funding and other investors started to look into what is happening here and can we invest in regenerative ag companies, or in the carbon funding of a protected area and corridors. So it is learning by doing, but it is super difficult because we are moving against the mainstream of our current economic model, which is still based on, if I may summarize it, on degrading our ecosystems.
Right. That is such an innovative approach to thinking about financing these landscape efforts. I think I look forward to watching and how some of these efforts evolve. Really impressed. One of the things that I've always struggled with when talking about landscape conservation or management is that concept of time. Like, we talk about these large spaces or these large landscapes, but when I try to tell, I remember working for the government and trying to tell my supervisor, well, it takes 10, 20 years for this effort to really play out. And, they kind of look at me a little strange, like, we do 4 or 5 years here. So what I found really refreshing about 4 Returns is that it articulates this number of years, 20 to 30 or a generation, before you can really start to see some of these returns that you're talking about. I guess the question, what does that number represent, and how did you get to that number, and how does that number resonate with various stakeholders, whether it be funders or whether it be people in the landscape?
Yeah. This is so difficult. You're so right. No, the number 20. When I started thinking about this whole thing, I was like you. I was always frustrated. You need decades and so on, or even longer. But when I was talking with investors and with family businesses, I realized that the number 20 had something magical because you could explain 20 with one generation. 20 years, more or less, is one generation. And especially family companies understand that very well. I'm not talking about, listed companies because they have a very different dynamic. But family companies understand that you need to think in generations, and 20 years stands for one generation. So that's why I started with minimum 20 years, 20 plus. And I could explain that. I could explain it to many of those family businesses, and some of them have, they also have their own philanthropic foundation. So when I started Commonland, I needed to, I was looking for funding for at least 20 years because this was the time that you could do something, right? And that was difficult at the beginning. It still is very difficult, to be honest, because many of the philanthropic foundations, as well as the public funders, still think in 5 years and have their own criteria. But I also learned that, and this is again something that has to do with the narrative, and it has to do with, I call it reality, the reality of what is happening on the ground. And if we all know what is happening on the ground, and we all know that that is really taking a lot of time. And that reality is not very well received in the reality of the vast moving world of economic and investments and all the money world, the Wall Street and the money world. But I learned also to talk to funders and to big corps if they approached me and were telling me that I was working in a very idealistic way. I challenged them and said, listen, I think that if you really see what's happening on the ground, that your way of working is idealistic and my way of working is realistic. So I changed that conversation. And that was good because then you finally had a better and a more profound conversation with each other. Because many people in cities and don't understand the reality of what it is to be a farmer, what it is to be working on the ground with your boots on, planting trees or whatever you do there. The reality of indigenous people, protected area managers, foresters, farmers, is not well understood. And that reality is about decades and not about 5 years or 3 years. It is actually about 7 generations.
Speaking of time, Willem, afraid we're running out of it, but this has been a great conversation and we're very thankful for having you as a guest today. We appreciate your time and the information you provided. Do you have any parting thoughts before we end our podcast?
Oh, thank you. Now it's wonderful to have this conversation. It's always too short, I know, because there's so many things going on. I think what is super important is that more people start to work together on these topics, and whether they come from the business world or the finance world or from the farmers world, we all need to restore our life, to restore and conserve the essence of our life support system. And I'm optimistic that whatever time frame we are now with all the polarization and the wars and whatever, that this message will land well, especially with the next generation, and that there is no alternative than working on a restorative or regenerative economy. So it will come one day or another, and it would be wonderful to continue this quest together with you and others.
Yes, I think it's safe to say that Tom and I would love to have you back, Willem, and explore more deeply some of different aspects of your Four Returns framework. Tom, do you have any parting thoughts to share?
I would love to have Willem on again at some point. We could dive into some of these questions later, but no, thank you so much for this great conversation.
Lovely. Yeah, I would love to come back. So yes, thank you very much for having me here.
Okay, well, thanks again to our guest, Willem Ferreira, and thank you, our listeners, for tuning in to Designing Nature's Half, the Landscape Conservation Podcast. I've been your co-host, Rob Campoloni.
And I've been your other co-host, Tom Mewald. Join us every 2 weeks for another informative episode of Designing Nature's Half, the Landscape Conservation Podcast. Thank you. Hi, this is Tom Mewald, co-host of Designing Nature's Half. And one of the initiatives that was briefly described in the podcast was the 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People initiative, which is a broad partnership that is developing the infrastructure and tools to support landscape management globally. Commonland is one of the founding partners, along with Eco-Agriculture Partners, Conservation International, Rainforest Alliance, UNDP, and Tech Matters. Through a co-creation process and radical collaboration, this initiative has identified and made powerful progress towards key pieces of the landscape puzzle that are meant to empower locally led partnerships. This includes developing best practices and training in all aspects of integrated landscape management. Beyond training modules, an important piece is technology. Landscape leaders need software and tools to support their activities, and that is being implemented through the development of an integrated set of technology tools called Terrasso. Also, one of the limiting factors that landscape leaders face is financing their strategic landscape plan. 1,000 Landscapes, embodied by a design team of financial experts, are developing finance tools and best practices to developing a financial plan for their landscape. 1,000 Landscapes also convened a dialogue series with financial experts to identify best practices and principles for what we're calling integrated landscape finance. Additionally, the initiative has begun energizing and growing the collaborative landscape movement. We are raising awareness and building enthusiasm for holistic landscape management through a comprehensive communications campaign. It's 1,000 Landscapes' ambition to ignite a global movement for landscape transformation. 1,000 Landscapes is committed to influencing policy and supporting landscape partnerships by identifying systemic barriers and opportunities for transformation. We're engaging in policy advocacy campaigns and partnering with key global initiatives to enhance landscape partnerships' visibility and impact. If you're interested in knowing more about 1,000 Landscapes for 1 Billion People, please check out their website. We'll put that in the show notes. Or you could reach out to me, Tom Mewald, at tmewald@ecoagriculturepartners.org.
Designing Nature's Half, the Landscape Conservation Podcast, is researched, written, edited, and produced by Rob Campoloni and Tom Mewald. Lucas Gallardi created the Designing Nature's Half cover art and logo design. Tom Askin is the voice behind the intro and outro, and the music was written and performed by composer Alexei Kistlin via Pixabay. Designing Nature's Half, the Landscape Conservation Podcast, is a proud member of Mind Matter Media, a startup multimedia network whose mission is to change the world by designing sustainable and resilient landscapes for people, planet, and prosperity.